Hello, everyone. We're not sure whether we have one of our colleagues whether he's here or not. Scott Simpson. Has anyone seen him? No? Scott Simpson? No? All right. Well, we're going to get started. So I wanted to begin, first of all, introducing myself. I'm Frederick. I'm a state senator from North and Northeast Portland. And I have, tomorrow will be the 10th anniversary of me being appointed to the House of Representatives in Oregon. It's humbling to be able to, frankly, be able to say that. I've had quite an experience over time here. Now, having said that, I also officially, as part of my non-elected issues, I have a consulting firm that looks at strategic planning and communications. It has been a bit moribund since my business partner died a couple of years ago, but I still try to work on different things and try and keep my fingers in the pot, if you will, to try to find out what's going on. There are other folks who do this full time, and we have three of them sitting up here who are doing different aspects of communication, political communications. And I want to have them start, and I don't want to go through a whole list and give you the bio of everybody. You all have one of these. I would encourage you to look at that. They are very informative. There's not a reason to spend the time on that. We want to spend some time on the communications issues. How many of you saw the New York Times this morning? Front page of the New York Times has an article that you should read. It is primarily talking about the national campaign and the Trump and the differences. I'm going to read one quote from it that is, I think, sort of gives a sense of what they're talking about. Let's see if I can find it here. I had it just a minute ago and I started reading more. This is probably a good quote. It compares the Democratic campaigns and the Trump campaigns in terms of media. It says, Republicans are not messaging around unity and civility because those things don't mobilize people. Adding that while everyone may want to live in a less divided country, no one takes time off work, gets in their car, and drives to the polls to vote specifically for that. Interesting quote and an interesting approach. I think we're going to need to look at that. I think we're going to need to look at a number of other issues that we've been struggling with for some time. And part of it is knowing who's out there, how to get in touch with them, and finding the new ways of really approaching folks. In my community, I have a significant portion of my community is not on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram. A significant portion of my community is not reading the newspaper. The Oregonian's a pamphlet basically now in terms of the size. People are not reading it. They are not subscribing to things. I have a whole rant I can go into regarding my former profession. I was a television reporter for 17 years for Channel 8 in Portland. And just so the quick version of that is that we no longer have bureaus in the basement of the Capitol. All commercial stations used to have a bureau in the basement of the Capitol. And so every day you'd have somebody there, a reporter or photographer, doing stories on what was going on. Their commercial stations no longer have that. They basically helicopter in based on a story on OPB. That's pretty much how they handle what's going on in the Capitol. And the classic example of that, I will go into this just a second. A classic example of that was this spring when we had the timber, whatever they're calling themselves now, circling the Capitol with log trucks. My former station had three crews down at the Capitol. One crew went up to the Senate to see us say, gavel in, and then say we're going to wait until our colleagues decide to come back from their vacation. The other two crews were outside watching the log trucks go around, interviewing people, And at the same time, in the House of Representatives, Oregon they were passing 40 bills, including paid family leave and a number of other things. And you never heard that story that day. The only story you saw was the log trucks. Because, first of all, the folks who were covering the news there didn't know, they probably could not have found the House of Representatives. Never mind know what was going on there. So we have a distinct break that's taken place there as well. I hope that you have several incredible people here, quite frankly. If you don't have to just read their bios, just realize the kind of work they've already done. Kathleen, Stuart, Jen Hernandez, Kasra, Shokat. I mispronounced it before. They are here, and I want them to begin to give us a sense, if you will, of what the landscape looks like regarding communications across, not just in terms of the national thing. We're going to all, I don't want us to be so obsessed with the national that we forget that the real key is the local. And I'm not just talking the legislative, I'm talking school board races, soil and water district, county commissioners, city council, because that's our bench, and they need to know where we're going with that. You cannot just rely on the things that you relied on in the past, obviously newspapers, but that also includes, in my view, flyers to your house. If you get overwhelmed by those, you stop paying attention to what's going on in terms of the campaign. And in the past, I've had to deal with consultants who told me that we needed to put 15 flyers in the hands of folks because they were making money on those flyers, quite frankly. And so that's part of the we've got to change that particular approach as well. So what are the best ways that give us a sense of the landscape, give us a sense of what you see as best practices at this particular time. I'm going to start with you.
Hi everyone, my name is Jen Hernandez. I work for the Pivot Group. So I think, in the last few elections, we've seen things change dramatically. We've seen an electorate that's been changing. We've seen a lot of money flowing into our campaigns, and that's affected just how we communicate with voters and how folks are really thinking about campaigns. I think we also have a lot of fresh blood that are coming into our campaigns and thinking about how, what platforms have we not used historically that we now have in our hands today, and how do we do that? How do we use that to reach voters and get our message out there, right? So I work for the Pivot Group. We're a direct mail firm. I think with my medium, a lot of people don't think of it as a fresh, sexy medium. I think there's a misunderstanding that it's not as effective as it used to be, and I don't mean to be the male advocate on this at all. As a millennial, I certainly thought that coming into this kind of work. I would not chosen it, but the more I've learned about it, the more I've realized how effective it can still be. However, I know that we have, an array of different tools, and I think that regardless of regardless of the race, the most effective way to really always have the strongest message out there is to layer it and have repetition out there. And it really depends on the resources that that specific campaign or race has. When you're talking about local and state races, they just don't have as much money as they do as national races or state, or larger races do ballot measures. And so using tools like digital or social media becomes much more valuable. But in my experience, I also think it should be done thoughtfully. And I think a lot of the times people are so eager to use tools without really putting strategy in place and really having folks who understand how these tools work and are able to use them to their full advantage. So I want to make sure that.
No, yeah, thanks, Jen. I'm Kathleen. I think just to dive in here.
Sorry, is this close enough? Can you hear me?
Okay, thank you. I got a tutorial on this before I started, and of course I didn't follow it already.
Think karaoke.
Yeah, right. Okay, karaoke.
She's an expert.
Truly not. So just to illustrate this point a little, I think one thing that we've done well in Oregon that I think other states, quite frankly, are catching up to, and often much to their kind of loss. Some Democrats across the country, we're seeing them lose because I think often are not applying this kind of strategy. What we've done in Oregon that's been so effective are two things. One is what we call run, govern, run in Oregon, and how many of you have heard that phrase at something here or maybe a cycle before the senator?
What's it called again? Talk too fast.
Sorry, I'll talk more slowly too. Run, govern, run. Is that familiar to anyone? I see some maybe nodding heads. Okay. So in Oregon, what we've done, I think it really started in 2010 and then was implemented in 2012. And both the people to my left and right and Senator Frederick, are very expert at using these in the field. So I'm just sharing kind of the strategy that we've put in place, but the experts are here. And I think what that really is going to voters kind of this time of year and saying what issues matter to you, running on those, and then governing on them, right? Which seems so simple, run on what you want to govern on, and then do what you said you would do. But what's interesting in Oregon is that this the strategy has allowed us to run on big, bold, progressive legislation, healthcare, paid family leave, the environment, right? And then go back and deliver on those things. And anyone in this room knows that we haven't delivered quite where some of us want to be on those issues, right? You're hearing, well, that sounds nice, but there's more to do. But the truth is, an issue like paid family leave, 2, 3, 4 years ago was this kind of crazy making. We would talk about it, and political people would say, "That's nice, that'll never happen." Well, we went to voters and asked them, "What do you want us to be focusing on in the state legislature?" Family leave was up there with 71% support among Oregon voters. We went in and did that, and now we get to go back to voters and say, "What do you want us to do next?" And that's allowed Oregon to lead, and quite frankly, Democrats to win. So, in response to kind of one of the ways that we can, I have some more ideas, but one of the ways we can combat this national rhetoric is by focusing on these big, bold, progressive things that Oregonians want. Not just the people in this room, kind of tried and true blue progressive, or however you identify as a Democrat, but working families in the state. Everyone knows we're struggling with child care, paid family leave, as just one example. So I'll stop there and hand it to Kaz.
I'm Kasra. I work at Winning Mark. We're a digital and direct mail media firm in Portland, but I'm going to focus today on digital and let Jen be the smartest person in the room.
Speak up.
Oh, is this better?
Yeah.
All right, so I'm going to start. How many people, raise your hand, opened up a print newspaper this morning? One, okay. How many people turned on the TV? And then how many people looked at their phone this morning? So that right there tells you that it's certainly the case that people are spending more and more time on their phones. We're not necessarily not consuming the news. It's not that we are not listening to the radio. It's that we are, listening to Spotify, Pandora. You are on the New York Times website, not opening up the front page. You're looking at what your friends are sharing on Facebook, not necessarily what used to be the case where the Oregonian had a broad message that everybody in the state could read. So everything is much more tailored towards you based on where you go, what you buy, what your vote history is, all those things that you do, all that personal sort of data is something that both media companies, sort of corporations, and then also political campaigns can target you with. So that's a new sort of phenomenon that we're seeing, which is media consumption online. And I think even you see with sort of television, where you're not just choosing between Comcast and broadband, DirecTV, you're choosing between Hulu, Amazon, Netflix. All these places are, it's build your own bundle of TV, and that's like another place where we don't have a TV person up here, but I guess I can trash TV a little bit since they're not here. But there's just more time being spent on platforms that have far more targetability, and so that's something that you're seeing with campaigns. I think Pete Buttigieg, even in the last month, has spent $790,000 on Facebook, and he's run over 10,000 ads. So it's not the case that all those 10,000 ads are receiving the same spend. He's testing a bunch of ads. Probably 9,000 of those were seen by 100 people before they said, "Oh, this message is not working." It's like a one exclamation point difference, or a button that looks slightly different. And all these things enable them to, bring in the most money, because that's really what the Democrats in the presidential primary are focused on right now. That's their sort of core accountability. That's their key performance metric in the kind of digital ads that we're running. And then I think to sort of Kathleen's point, the run, govern, run, we saw that a lot in 2018 with candidates both across the country in the midterms and then also in Oregon. I think this a heightened focus on authenticity of a candidate and emotion-driven messages. One example is Senator Shumia Fagan, who in her primary, would take a selfie video almost every day, and it wasn't super messagey. She didn't have a consultant telling her, say this, say this, say this. She was at the door. She just had a conversation with a voter, and she's sort of sharing what the mood is in that particular precinct. And then I think we also saw it with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She had a fantastic launch video that was not, again, written by consultants. When she's attacked by Republicans for having this fun dance video at Boston University, she flips it on them and gets 24 million views of her video dancing in a congressional office. So it's not being afraid of those moments where your opponents attack you. It's doubling down on you being really, really focused on the issues that people care about and that you're passionate about and that voters are going to come out on election day and elect you for. And then here in Oregon, I think we did that well on Measure 105. We helped defeat that measure, which would have repealed Oregon sanctuary state status. It was defeated by 27 points. One of the videos that got the most traction was not a video that we wrote. It wasn't a video that a TV consultant wrote. We actually hired a documentary filmmaker, and he said, hey, we've got to put the faces and voices of immigrants in this video. And it ended up being a video where we brought in 24 immigrants, including my grandfather, and they participated in a video that where they just said, this is my name, this is where I come from, we're all Oregonian. This is about sort of protecting Oregon values, and it got traction in the national media, the local media, and the money that you spend on that sort of really viral creative more than sort of outweighs the cost that you could be spending on paying to promote it. So I think a heightened focus on that sort of authentic creative is going to be really important in 2020. So I'll stop there.
Where did that video get run? Where did you show it?
Yeah, so it was run on YouTube. It was bilingual, so we were able to target both English and Spanish speaking voters in Oregon. And then it was on Facebook, Twitter, and then news outlets posted it. Now This actually created an alternate version of it, and they tweeted it out and got a lot of traction, so yeah.
Excuse me? How are you driving traffic to these things?
So we're driving, there's kind of two pieces. So we, there's the platform and then there's the targeting. So we go into the voter file just like Pivot would, just like Kathleen would when they're pulling field lists or mail lists, and we say, we want voters who have voted in, for the last 6 primaries, they are likely Democrats, and then we take that data, we export it, and we match it to digital platforms like Facebook, social media users, or YouTube based on your IP address, and then we serve you ads based on that. So that ensures we're not wasting dollars on folks who are never going to be persuaded to vote for our measure, or folks who have already voted. In Oregon, and there's a 3-week voting period, so we can stop serving ads to people as they vote.
Go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to add a point to what Kasra just said. In terms of authenticity, I think that is so true. And when it comes to Senator Fagan and Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, their personality is so big. I feel like they're unicorns when it comes to candidates, and that comes into play. But what happens when you don't have a candidate like that, right? But I think it's still very important for themselves to also be just as authentic and finding the mediums and the ways for them to be able to portray their values in a real way, because voters nowadays can call out bullshit, sorry, but they can nowadays so fast, and it's very important for them to be able to relay a message that is true to who they are, and also the people that they're hoping to represent. And something that I've noticed, especially in the last 2 years, is just the amount of investments that other groups are doing. We're a DC-based firm. We have an office in California, and we do a lot of great work in Oregon, which is my home state. But we get to work with a lot of organizations that are doing really great research into electorates that haven't been, looked upon in the past. And being able to gauge what kind of messages resonate for them, and they're often what we found is that they are a little bit different than the messages that we've used before. So to Kaz's point of these are the faces, and these are these folks are in our community, and they're immigrants, and we need to protect them. It sounds so basic, but I think in the past we've been so afraid to carry out those messages because we didn't have the research to back them up. And I think we're getting to a place where we're finally able to to be able to you know, persuade people into making those kind of investments for voter outreach.
Go ahead, Kathleen.
I love where this conversation is going. I just have 2 points to add. Can you hear me okay now? First of all, is I think that big, bold personality that we're talking about with both of those candidates comes from candidates who are being authentically themselves and kind of owning that, right? In the last decade, we've seen especially women running, and I've recruited a lot of women who run for the state house and state senate, saying, well, I want to be the kind of cookie cutter legislator. I'm going to look like the next guy running in the next seat over. And now we're saying to people, run as yourself. You're a mom, you're a person taking care of their elderly parent, you're a home care worker. Great, tell that story on the campaign trail. Make it about who you really are. If you're a person of color, an immigrant, own that, right? It's part of who you are, and that's part of your not just brand, but what voters want to hear from you, right? They want to know that story. So that's one thing. The other thing I wanted to make sure to mention on this panel, you know, I think outside of digital and, you know, TV and mail, I think one of the things we're doing in Oregon, have started to do, although we should have started this more authentically a long time ago, is kind of campaigns being community-led instead of campaign-led. And what that meant in 2018 was campaigns like Governor Kate Brown's actually investing in community-led groups like Beckman, like Apano, and saying, how do you want to write a plan to reach voters in your community, and actually putting dollars toward that, right? Not just saying, hey, go do your thing. Hey, here's an investment in your program. You tell us what that program should look like, and we'll give you the investments that you need to make that possible, including regular staff support. And so that's something we really leaned into in 2018, and I think allowed us to reach communities, you know, including, you know, in the campaign for 105 against 105, you know, really lifting up communities and bringing them, helping them get their ballots in, and honestly telling those stories. So just wanted to make sure to add that.
Well, I want to get back to something that you mentioned as well. People do have a bullshit monitor, but it changes over the years. It changes there for each campaign. Folks are no longer as persuaded by a picture of a candidate walking along with a group of kids or with a hard hat. They no longer, that doesn't resonate as much as it once did. It also, there's also not there's not a sense, okay, of being vague about, you're standing up and you say, I'm for education, everybody goes, yeah, and, but at one time it was, that's what you did, you stood up, candidates stood up and said they were for education, or they're for healthcare. I mean, even the healthcare, what does that mean exactly? People want to know a little bit more about that. How do we track where that point is, where that tipping point is now, and where do you go from there? We are going to be dealing with some pretty significant campaigns coming up here in the state that are going to be difficult in places like Bend or the coast or the valley. There are some things that we could be doing, but we need to figure out how we track those local campaigns as well. How do you do that? What do you do to do that?
I mean, I guess I would start by saying every campaign is going to be different, which is, you know, I think we saw it in 2018 where, you know, the 105 campaign, it was very story driven, and the measures 103 and 104 campaigns, which were those corporate tax carve out campaigns, we really led with just, you know, these are all the 10 to 15 flaws with those measures, and we just hit them over and over and over, and it didn't really matter who said them, it was just had to be in voters' faces. And by the end, I think the 104 campaign lost by the biggest margin of all the ballot measures last year. So that's one thing I would say. The other piece is I think that it still comes down to a lot of testing. You have to test all your messages for each campaign. At mail, it's, I think Jen was talking about like EIPs, and digital, we can do it sort of in the real world and real time. And it's also the case that you can't simply just throw your best performing 30-second TV ad on digital, assume that it'll persuade people. If people only watch 2 seconds of that TV ad, it's not going to persuade anybody. So how on digital do you test other creative? A 6-second video, AOC had a 2-minute launch video, our 105 video is 90 seconds. All these videos are testable, and so I think it's pushing whoever you're working with, if it's mail, it's digital, it's TV, to say, you know, we have this great research, but how do we actually test it out in the real world to all these different segments of voters?
Yeah. Thanks, guys. And I would just add here, I think one of the things we're doing more of in the state and need to push to do more of continually is more focus groups and just hearing from voters one-on-one. And, you know, of course, there's the fancy version where you do a $30,000 focus group, right, which is ridiculous, and we all need to talk about how much money is in politics right now. But the other way you can do it, right, if you're running a local campaign, is pull together people in your neighborhood, right, or a neighborhood next to you, and share with them key messages that you want to be talking about and get their thoughts on it, and do that kind of around a kitchen table or something a little more grassroots. I would say we have to be careful, you know, we're not testing those messages with ourselves. We're all kind of...
Or those marginalized communities, who do they talk with? How do they determine that?
I'll start, although, you know, there's better messengers than me on this panel for this, so I'll turn to experts, you know, after this, and I'll talk together, I think, about what we've done in Oregon. I think a couple of strategies, you know, as Jen shared, we're often going back to basics. You know, we've seen these campaigns where we're running, you know, I think back in, there's these stories in 2005, 2006, of these campaigns running, you know, 20 pieces of direct mail, which costs, you know, $250,000 on its own, and then you have the whole campaign on top of that. And quite frankly, you know, as anyone would tell you, even a direct mail firm, you know, direct mail and digital, all of these elements, they all, how effective they are, reduce with every piece you do. So the best way to be really effective in any campaign is to layer them. And then what we've seen, as Jen was sharing, is this kind of return and back to basics. So instead of these flashy campaign-looking communications, whether on any channel, really going back to person, and the senator was mentioning this. So a couple of the strategies we've been employing in Oregon, one is texting. How many of you text messaged someone in the last campaign? Okay, great, perfect. So in the coordinated campaign alone across the state, we texted 41% of Oregon voters in the state. And that was the first time we'd employed a large-scale text messaging program. So it was fairly new to Oregon, fairly new to most of the states where we interviewed folks around women, lower-income voters. So there's a lot of work to do there, and I think we've been rightfully focused on that. But I think there's still a focus on seniors, people who may be homebound. So a couple ideas. One, texting works for this community, or potentially for these communities. You can reach them by targeting on the voter file. We can talk about mail and digital too. Another thing that we've invested in, I think, and had great results in Oregon, is the Neighborhood Leader Program. How many of you are neighborhood leaders? Or, yeah, amazing, right? So this last cycle, I think up until, it's been going along for a long time, right? There's whole counties that have been engaging in this strategy for a long time. In 2018, we put quite a bit more money and metrics behind it, set goals by county, and then invested in actual, giving them door hangers and, investing in this program being an effective tool. And you could reach out to someone in a community like that and say, hey, will you be a neighborhood leader in your, senior community or something, and go talk to your friends about voting as part of your social circle. So that's one idea.
Yeah, and I think another trend we're seeing, I think there is a misconception that digital is just, millennials using it, but actually we're seeing that folks over the age of 55 do engage on Facebook 2 to 3 times higher than younger people. So take with that what you will, but we're seeing a ton more engagement there. And we also saw it, as Kathleen was talking about last cycle, when we one thing we did is we brought all the ballot measures together. I mean, there was a progressive coalition that was pushing for, no on 103 through 106 and a yes on the affordable housing measure. And we ran a really robust both field, direct mail, and online voter guide program. And what we found is that, when people are looking for more information, you hear that in focus groups a lot. Someone says, I don't want to make up my mind, I want to learn more about these measures. And it actually really bore out in the results we saw online when 219,000 people got to our online voter guide. And they did that through searching things like, what is Measure 103? Like, I want to know what that is. And we made sure that the first result in search was not, go to yeson103.com or go to no103.com. It was the OregonVoterGuide.com. And when you click through there, you've got 102, 103, 104, 105, 106. It's all the progressive groups that we trust. NARAL, Planned Parenthood, Beckman, all these groups are listed as, you know, endorsing a no on this slate, and it's really easy to scroll through, and within 90 seconds, you know, got it. This is how I'm voting on these ballot measures that I maybe didn't understand before. I think in other states you see innovative strategies for GOTV around, you know, targeting precincts on election day. In Oregon, it's different. We've got to run a search campaign for 3 weeks because people vote in their living rooms. We see on the first weekend there's this huge bump. It goes down, and then on that Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, right up to election day, that's when people come in. The nice thing about running a search campaign is we're not trying to guess how much we should be spending every day. Our spend just sort of trends with how voters are. And we actually saw that as ballots came in, that is when our search traffic was sort of going up and down. So that's another effective strategy that we deployed last year. And then I think another theme that both Kathleen and Jen have hit on is sort of decentralized messaging and sort of making sure that you're talking to people not necessarily as the campaign, but with, you know, friends and family. And I think one really good example of that is the Elizabeth Warren selfie line that you probably have seen, maybe you haven't, but if you haven't, it's basically at the end of every event, Elizabeth Warren will take a photo with, you know, any supporter at the event. And I think in 2018, maybe the strategy would have been, you know, let's post every single one of these to Elizabeth Warren's Instagram account. We'll have hundreds of thousands of photos on her feed. But her digital team is, you know, super smart, and they take the user's phone, they take a photo with their phone, they hand it back to them, and that person can then post the photo on their account. The most powerful persuasion message for Elizabeth Warren comes from your mom or your stepsister or whoever. It doesn't come from Elizabeth Warren. So I think that's another piece that it even goes down to hiring on local campaigns. Make sure your campaign manager is someone who, you know, has used Facebook or Twitter before, can, you know, do text banking in addition to door knocking. So, you know, making sure down to even the local level that you're sort of bringing folks in the door who have experience with all these tools.
Yeah, so I kind of think that in order to engage and continue to organize these communities that have been marginalized, like seniors and communities of color, it kind of goes beyond the campaign. These are communities that we have to make long investments in, not just for this cycle, but for future cycles. And that work is done by a lot of amazing local groups in the state, particularly in Oregon. I think this state has been able to organize and create a table with a lot of, you know, partners who are progressive and are working hard to make differences in their community. And that, trust me, like, is so radically different than a lot of the states in around the country. And I think that's why Oregon has been able to be blue, continue to be blue, and pass some great legislation for Oregonians and working families. And it's such a stark contrast to what's going on nationally. So, you know, I just want to give major props to everyone who's done work here in Oregon to be able to strengthen that table. But, you know, I do want to say that in order to continue to engage and empower these communities, there needs to be investments done that go, you know, beyond the election cycles.
Thank you. I want to move to another issue, though. Quite frankly, we've been sort of resting on our laurels in terms of the state being blue. As I'm told by my colleagues in the Senate, Oregon is actually more purple or red if you just go by land area. I also have to say to them that you know, acres don't vote, people do. But the fact, well, that's actually my point. Actually, how do we directly address? Maybe you don't want to give this away right now, but how is there? Can you give suggestions on how we directly address those folks who have been effectively propagandized by the folks who have done put the logging trucks on the road and done all of these things? We're saying that, you know, that no one's paying attention to them, that they believe that. What is the strategy for dealing with that section of Oregon that says, you know, the metro area doesn't care anything about us, and how do we address those?
Yeah, so I want to talk about this through a messaging standpoint. In 2018, we did another test with Planned Parenthood where we had different pieces, basically the same piece, going out to Arizona voters on the Kyrsten Sinema race. And what we did was test two different pieces. One, going to Democrats with more of a liberal messaging. We had Kyrsten Sinema is a trusted advocate, or more of that kind of language. And then for the piece that was going to go to more conservative voters, we swapped up the language, and instead of trusted advocate, we said proven patriot. And then we kind of wove in that messaging throughout the piece. And it was the exact same piece, the same design, both coming from Planned Parenthood with the logo. So there was folks are familiar with what Planned Parenthood is and the values they stand for. But what we found was that the conservative voters were still receptive to our message. And I think that just goes to show you that sometimes folks are willing to hear your message if they understand what you're saying, and you just have to find ways to do that.
Yeah, well, I would look at this maybe from a candidate standpoint. I don't know how many of you are thinking about running for office or running your own campaigns, but I think one of the ways we reach voters in rural Oregon is with your candidate profile. We saw Jamie McLeod Skinner, I see a button up here, run a very effective campaign, a very grassroots campaign recently, really, and I think highlighting her profile and who she is, and connecting with voters on issues that they cared about, right? Hey, I'm a rural Oregonian, and here are the issues that matter to me. And I talked about Run, Govern, Run, which is really about identifying those issues that voters care about, and then running on them and keeping it in surround sound the entire time, right? Once you set those messages, sticking with them, making sure voters hear them. They need to hear them 5 to 7 times before they're even starting to remember them. By the time, as a candidate or a campaign practitioner, if you're starting to get sick of that message, that means you're finally breaking through to voters, right? I often have staff at the end say, I'm so tired of this message, we've used it over and over, can we just switch? I'm like, no, that means it's actually working. So when you are sick to death of it and it's carved into your brain or etched into your brain, that's what's working. On issues, I think, I mentioned this, but I think, focusing on those issues that matter, and it might be hyper-local, right? Is there, in Bend, when we ran a campaign, we've run a number of campaigns out here, and I think one of the things we've done well is, we talked about overall issues, but really focusing on water issues, environmental issues that are affecting housing issues that are affecting the Bend area, for example. So finding those issues within your overall message landscape that resonate with local voters and rural voters. And then finally, there's going to be some voters in your electorate, in your voter roll, that just are not receptive to who you are and what you're doing, right? Especially if you're a Democrat and you should be running on a couple of bold progressive issues that resonate with working families, like healthcare or education might be one of those, or being a pro-choice, candidate, for example. There's going to be some voters who are just turned off by that, right? They just don't want to vote for you, and you have to be willing to just cut some of those people loose, right? They're just never going to be your people. Don't waste time on those folks and leave out the voters who could be tapped to vote for you and maybe haven't been engaged. Progressives especially, I think I've left out minority voters, women, et cetera, and I think have to do a better job of that moving forward. Thanks.
Thank you. There's an older movie that a few people will remember in here, The Candidate, where at the end, where he ends up babbling in the back seat because he said the same thing over and over again. If you get a chance, it's a Robert Redford movie. It's 70s, 1972 or something like that.
Post-Watergate.
Pardon?
It's post-Watergate.
Is it post-Watergate?
Yeah.
I didn't realize that. Okay. Anyway, it's interesting. And there's an example that we had from several years ago where a particular school district, who I'm intimately familiar with, not while I was there, but decided to run a campaign for a bond measure, and decided that because the Native American folks were not voting, that they didn't really need to go to the Native American community to promote it, and they lost by about 600 votes. With the Native American community, that's about 30,000 in the district. So they went, the next time they went for the bond, they went directly to that community. They learned something from that. But I've gotta say that we still haven't, got a sense of how to, you're right, we have to cut some folks loose. And I, my district is, I jokingly call it the People's Republic of Portland, because it has, I have 5,700 Republicans registered, out of, 120,000, something like that.
Wow.
It's a different district. But I think there are more Greens who are registered than Republicans. But the fact is, we have other districts where it's difficult to get the point across. My district is different than, even not very far away. I mean, the district that Shamir Fagan ran in, or Janelle Bynum has run in, they're not blue districts. They have a slight registration edge, but they have a significant. I'm going to try to separate the two between Trump folks and conservatives. I think that's a different. Those are two different groups, quite frankly. But this is the concern that I have across the state. As I traveled in Eastern Oregon just a month ago, it was clear that the farmers in the Boardman area did not feel as though they could trust the Democrats. So we need to figure out how we deal with that. I'm going to start with some questions, and I see Jesse way in the back there with his hand up first, so I'll go with him first.
Thank you all for being here. We're pretty excited by the research that Demos had done with Anat Shankar-Osario to show that actually when we talk about race and class together, we actually perform better with not only progressives, but persuadables as well. But Democrats have often shied away from tackling race and sort of run the opposite direction and just wanted to talk about class. I'm wondering how you all are seeing that research being uplifted. I know it's been used a lot in Minnesota and Michigan for pretty successful statewide and candidate races. So I'm just wondering how you're seeing that play out in Oregon, and how it's informing your research on messaging and narrative.
Yeah, so thank you, Jesse, for that question. Yeah, I mean, I definitely, I'm definitely excited at the fact that there's finally research that shows that you can talk about these issues and not offend voters, which was, I think, the fear, or that these conversations were too hard to have. And I think to that point, something that we mentioned a little earlier that we kind of hammered on was to be authentic, right? And we're at a time where these issues are being talked about every day in the news and different articles. And so I think for candidates to not talk about these things is just doesn't really do anything to strengthen their candidacy. Because voters want to hear about what they have to say about those topics. And so what we've done, particularly with a group that we work with called Somos Votantes, they're doing a lot of groundbreaking research and are playing on a lot of different battleground states throughout the country. Most recently, we've been working with them on things in Virginia. They have an election on November 5th for the delegate house, and those races are going to be close. It's Virginia. We know that voters are, I think traditionally we think that voters don't want to talk about race or I also think that a lot of the times we've been targeting voters with, we haven't been targeting the communities that are actually impacted by race or class. So I think now we're finally including them into programs. So the work that this group and a lot of groups like them are doing are actually taking the time and the energy and the money to communicate with these folks, and I think we're finally able to have an honest conversation with them where they feel seen and heard, and hear about the issues that they really care about that impact their lives. So I don't know if that answers your question at all, but I've been seeing it become a driver now in different races, and I think there's been a lot of success to that. And so, yeah, I'll pass it off. Okay.
Yeah, I think we also saw those messages come out, not just in like the 105 campaign, but we worked on some environmental ballot measures in Arizona and Nevada. And there's some pretty awful statistics about the degree to which communities of color, live in more polluted areas and high traffic areas, and that's a message that we leaned on heavily in those campaigns. We're leaning heavily on them in some legislative efforts right now in Nevada. And then I also think it's sort of giving candidates the confidence to be open about that. I think Representative Janelle Bynum, she's been racially profiled, her daughter has been racially profiled. She went out and wrote an op-ed in the Oregonian, which I think, 4 years ago someone might have said, hey, be careful, but she went out there and did it, and she's gotten a ton of support, and she's been kicking ass in her elections, and I think that's a big reason why it comes back to authenticity, not shying away from sort of those issues and coming out and being vocal about why that's wrong.
Yeah, I think it's more about what are white Democrats doing to talk about, Janelle can't help but talk about race just by being. So how are you helping white Democrats prepare for that conversation and actually help lead on that conversation?
Well, thanks, Jesse. I would say I don't have all the answers for sure here. I just want to acknowledge that. I think two things come to mind for me, and I'm going to take a look at this research more closely because I haven't seen it, but thanks for raising it. One is that this idea, I think in Oregon, that still exists, that that race or these issues are kind of a Portland thing, or like people see rural Oregon as pretty white, and that's really discounting a ton of people of color that live in rural Oregon and work in rural Oregon, right? And we think, oh well, Portland's really racially diverse. Well, look at Woodburn, look at Eastern Oregon, farm workers, people of color, of all Native Americans living in these communities. So that's a little too broad brush. I wish I had more statistics on that, but I just want to raise that. I think there's some groups now talking about that and doing great work, but white Democrats need to be lifting that up too and making sure it's part of the conversation, and that's on us to do that. The second thing I just want to say out loud is that we need more candidates of color, and that includes white candidates stepping aside to make room for those candidates. So I think that's something as campaign practitioners we have to be saying out loud when we speak about campaigns, and also saying to candidates when there's a chance to step aside for a person of color, a woman, that we're doing that, basically just putting our actions where our words are.
And to add on to what Kathleen said, I think beyond just recruiting candidates of color, I think we need to have strategists of color and folks at every level that are actually affected by these issues, because it's not just the candidate who is running the campaign by themselves, and I think it really depends on who is helping to drive their campaign and their messaging, and that's equally as important as the team that they hire and they work with.
Let me give a quick example of what I'm talking about and my concern. Klamath Falls hasn't really had a full campaign for a Democrat in a long time. But Klamath Falls has some significant issues regarding water, regarding the tribes down there, all of those for the Klamath tribe. Why we've got to speak to those folks at some point, and we have not done that very well. Yes, question over here.
Yeah, my name is Tony Bigelow. I'm a senior scientist at the Oregon Research Institute, and two things. One is, I thought what you were going to say from that New York Times article was the quote that said that what the Trump campaign is like a supercar racing a little Volkswagen Bug, because what this article is about is the degree to which digital marketing is not being used at the presidential level, and I'm interested in how much micro-targeting you're doing in this. But the other question I want to ask is whether you're familiar with Jonathan Haidt's work on moral sentiments, and the evidence that he has. The progressives appeal to people on the basis of two of those moral sentiments, caring and fairness, but that conservatives appeal to people on the basis of 6 moral sentiments, and that progressives' failure to talk about things like loyalty, patriotism, and so on, just leaves out affecting people. And the example you gave from Arizona, I think, was a good one in which they were using one of the moral sentiments other than caring and fairness. I'd be interested in any of your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I guess to take your second question first, I do think there are groups out there that are conducting that sort of research. Grow Progress is one of them. They're sort of going out into the field and sort of testing how those sort of frameworks that people use with decision making impacts their voting choices. And so that testing is in early phases, but yes, it's happening on our side too. As far as micro-targeting goes, yes, we do a lot of micro-targeting. Some platforms allow for more of it than others, but you know, when it's available, we use it. And then in the presidential piece, I do think that Trump does have the advantage of being the only candidate on the right. We forget that we have, I don't know how many right now, but close to 20 candidates who are, you know, all splitting their money, all splitting their targeting, and splitting the sort of brain power of bringing together a really robust sort of messaging, digital, creative team together. And so I think it's, well, it's never too early to sort of get that sort of technology and plan in place. I think it is a little too early to say we're not going to win because of that. I think that
Read the Times article. I'm worried.
I would also add, I think the people on this panel, I'll speak for myself. I'm not here to apologize for the National Democrats losing the last election. Was a tragedy, and it happened for a lot of, I think, preventable reasons and some outside of our control. And quite frankly, Democrats across the country are used to losing. And I think what we can do here in Oregon is win what we can control and stay really focused on that. So that's what I would say. I feel just as betrayed as anyone in this room for losing those campaigns.
The issues the thing that I would like for you all to speak to at the very end, because I think we're going to be closing up here very shortly. I really need to have a sense of an action you think that the folks here in this room can take for this campaign. Something that they can do right now and that they can follow up on for the next few months, you know, for the next year, basically. What is it, what's the top action you think they should take in dealing with the campaigns that they're facing? Because we have folks who are running for office, we have folks who are the campaign managers for other campaigns, we have folks who are the spouses of people who are running for office. And they need to have a sense of what they can do at this particular point.
Real quick, I just wanted to correct the record. Your name again, I'm sorry.
Kasra?
I just want to make sure everyone knows my wife and I wrote that op-ed regarding the Janelle Biden profile. We also wrote the statute that stems from that. So I just want to make sure if you're spreading that, you know, you Rice Johnson and then King Henry Johnson. Cool.
Thanks.
Thank you for that.
Proceed.
Yeah, so, I mean, I think with Democrats, you all are highly engaged with the process just by the fact that you're in this room, right? And so for you, the election feels close, so close. And I think for everyday folks, it's not even on the radar. So I think something that we can do here directly after this is to not be afraid to have real conversations with our family members and our friends, specifically with issues that are hard to talk about, like race and class, and letting people know, like, you know, what efforts you're working on, and inviting them to join. I think a lot of the times we're afraid to, you know, do the actual people organizing when it comes to campaigns. And I think right now that's what is going to be most effective in the work that we can do to help build a robust campaign for whatever, you know, level of office you may be running for, whatever candidate you're supporting of, whatever issue you care about. I think right now what's most important in my perspective is to do, you know, a lot of organizing and a lot of just talking to voters as volunteers.
Yeah, what Jen said. And I've already spoken about in this panel a couple of things I think we've done well in 2018 and can continue to do better. But what I'd leave everyone with is that just to remember that in Oregon, we've been stronger by working together. You know, it's evidenced in 2018, we all came together, you know, set egos aside, set kind of individual campaign aside, and came together and won really, really big across the state. And we'll continue to be stronger and win by doing that. So let's keep that up.
Yes, I think what both of you said, for sure. I also think that we've talked a little bit about the Timber Unity sort of log truck situation at the Capitol and the Senate walkout that came after that. But I also think before that there was a really big movement on our side with the Student Success Act, where thousands of educators, parents, families came out, and I think folks have forgotten that because it did pass, and as Kathleen said, it's really important to sort of talk about these issues that we pass that we know people care about. So I would say showing up for those sort of events and in the sort of real world, putting your phone down, that sort of stuff gets a lot of news coverage, which then is sort of goes more broadly to the public in Oregon. So I think those movements don't start online; they start in person at the doors at the Capitol. So get out there.
I'm gonna try to end this right.
Can I just interject, speak on behalf of the young Democrats of Oregon who have given this advice, that if they can reach out to kids at colleges and other places, they can speak to the Latinx community about getting their parents to register to vote in the primary and vote and get get involved in this. The same for the tribal communities, and they want to reach out to the non-affiliated voters this time. I don't know how many people have seen this group here, but the leader got sick the other day and she had to leave. But this is an effective group, and we should really employ them because they can reach in every single county of the state and reach out to the young people to then get to even the high school students to register them so they're ready to vote when, as Democrats when the time comes. But that's an effective group, and their strategy was really bright. It was like, wow, yeah, that's because it's hard to sit in a Catholic church and try to reach out to Latino voters who think that maybe you're ICE or something else. But if it's the kids going to their parents and saying, this is important for us. This is something that we haven't talked about in this room, so I just don't want to leave and not speak on the behalf of that fine group that is growing, but not growing as fast as it might, especially when so many young people are here in this conference and probably haven't joined up with them or even know that they're in existence. So when we leave, we should pay attention and spread that word.
I appreciate that. Let me end this with something that I say at some point in every chat that I end up dealing with. Who are you affiliated with? Is it your church? Are you a stamp collector? Are you, whatever groups you happen to have an affiliation with, you need to make sure that you're talking with them, not just within your geographic community, but if you have relatives and friends in the rest of the state, which is unusual, by the way, now, out of the metro area. It's something that a Republican told me, Tom McCall, back in the late 70s, early 80s, he said to me that he was worried that most of the people in the metro area no longer had relatives in the rest of the state. So there was not a family connection. They may have argued around the Thanksgiving table, but they were family and they argued around the Thanksgiving table, which is different than just arguing. You had respect for Uncle George, who was a farmer somewhere in Grant County. That kind of thing was a different thing. So we need to reconnect with whoever you have as an affiliation with across the state. That's a person-to-person connection. That's not necessarily a digital connection, although digital can help. But we need to find a way to do that and then expand the support that we have for the values that the Democratic Party has. Not necessarily for the Democratic Party, but for the values, and point out that that's what we're talking about. I appreciate this, and I am going to try to end on time so that we can get into hear the Secretary of State's race. I'm particularly interested in that race, so if we can get going, I want to thank you all for being here, and I'm sure that there are folks that are still going to be around for a bit. If you want to catch somebody, please do. Thank you.